Hello everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. This one is different. This one doesn't give you the kind of fear that makes you lock your doors. It gives you the kind of fear that settles deep in your chest, the kind that makes you realize that the world has always had its monsters, and sometimes those monsters are never found. Sometimes the darkness wins, and the families who are left behind are forced to carry the weight of unanswered questions for decades. What I'm about to tell you is one of the most heartbreaking, most overlooked, most infuriating cases in American true crime history. Between April of 1971 and September of 1972, 6 young black girls were abducted off the streets of Washington, D.C. They were murdered. Their bodies were left along the freeways that stretched through the nation's capital. And the person who did it was never caught. He was given a name by the media, a name that still echoes through the streets of Southeast D.C. more than 50 years later, the Freeway Phantom. Now, to understand this case, you have to understand the world these girls lived in. You have to go back to 1971. You have to picture Washington, D.C., not the D.C. of marble monuments and presidential motorcades, not the D.C. of tourists snapping photos in front of the Lincoln Memorial. I'm talking about the other D.C., the one that existed behind the postcard image, the neighborhoods of Southeast Congress Heights, Anacostia, Berry Farm. These were communities of working-class black families. Tight-knit neighborhoods where everybody knew everybody, where kids played outside until the streetlights came on, where mothers sent their children to the corner store without a second thought, because the store was just around the block, and the block was safe, and the neighborhood looked out for its own. That was the world, that was the reality. And in 1971, that reality was already being tested. The Vietnam War was tearing the country apart. In May of that year, the May Day protests erupted across D.C. Thousands of anti-war demonstrators flooded the streets, blocking intersections, shutting down bridges. The government responded with mass arrests. More than 12,000 people were swept up by police in what became the largest mass arrest in American history. The city was in chaos. Law enforcement was stretched thin. Resources were being diverted. Attention was everywhere except where it needed to be. And while all of this was happening, while the nation's capital was consumed by protests and politics and the machinery of war, a predator was moving through the quiet streets of Southeast D. He was watching. He was choosing. And on the evening of April 25, 1971, he made his first move. Carol Danae Spinks was 13 years old. Let me say that again because I need you to sit with it. 13 years old. She was a child. A little girl with her whole life stretching out in front of her like an open road. Carol was one of 8 children. Her mother, Alantine, was raising them mostly on her own in Southeast D.C. If you've ever grown up in a big family, you know what that looks like. It's loud, it's chaotic, it's beautiful. Kids are everywhere. There's always someone to talk to, always someone to argue with, always someone to share a laugh with. Carol had an identical twin sister named Carolyn. Think about that. Someone who looked exactly like her, who shared her face, her smile, her laugh. The family called Carol by her nickname. They called her Bebe. She was the kind of kid who loved playing games with her brothers and sisters. She was the kind of kid who would light up a room without even trying. She was just a normal 13-year-old girl, living her life in the only world she knew. On the evening of April 25th, a Sunday, Carol's mother had stepped out to visit family nearby. She told the kids to stay home. But you know how it goes with kids. Carol's older sister Valerie wanted some things from the store. A soda, some bread, TV dinners. Simple stuff. The 7-Eleven was about half a mile away, just across the Maryland border. It was still light outside. The store was a straight shot from the house. Valerie gave Carol $5 and sent her on her way. And Carol went. Because why wouldn't she? She'd probably made that walk 100 times before. The streets were familiar. The route was routine. There was nothing to be afraid of. On her way to the store, Carol actually crossed paths with her mother, who was returning home. Her mother saw her walking toward the 7-Eleven and told her to hurry up and come straight home. Carol said she would. She continued on to the store. A clerk at the 7-Eleven saw her. She came in, bought the items and left. She was seen walking out with her bag of groceries, and then she disappeared. Somewhere between the 7-Eleven and her home, in that half-mile stretch of sidewalk and streetlights and familiar houses, Carol Spinks vanished. She never made it home. One moment she was there, a 13-year-old girl carrying a bag of TV dinners and soda, and the next moment she was gone, just gone, as if the earth had opened up and swallowed her home. When Carol didn't come home, her mother filed a missing persons report that same night. The family searched, neighbors searched, but there was nothing, no sign of her, no clue, no trace, just silence. 6 days passed. 6 agonizing days of not knowing. 6 days of hoping that maybe she'd run away, maybe she was with a friend, maybe there was some explanation that didn't involve the worst thing a parent could imagine. And then on May 1st, a group of children playing near a freeway embankment made a discovery that would shatter any remaining hope. Behind St. Elizabeth's Hospital, on a grassy slope next to the northbound lanes of Interstate 295, about 1,500 feet south of Suitland Parkway, they found the body of Carol Spinks. She was still wearing the clothes she'd had on when she disappeared, the same outfit, but her shoes were gone. They were just Miss was there, but her shoes had been taken. The medical examination revealed the horror of what had happened to her. Carol had been sexually assaulted. She had been physically beaten, and she had been strangled to death. But here's the thing that made the investigators stop and think. Based on the condition of her body, Carol hadn't been killed on the night she disappeared. She had been kept alive for days. The forensic evidence suggested that she had only been dead for 2 or 3 days before her body was found, which meant that for at least 3 or 4 days after she was taken, Carol Spinks had been alive. Somewhere. In someone's control, in someone's power. I want you to think about that. I want you to sit with that for a moment. A 13-year-old girl, held captive for days. What she must have gone through. What she must have felt, the fear, the confusion, the helplessness. She was a child. She didn't understand what was happening. She just wanted to go home. She just wanted to see her mom, her twin sister, her brothers and sisters, and whoever had her, whoever had taken this little girl off the street, held onto her for days before finally ending her life and dumping her body beside a freeway like she was nothing, like she was trash, like her life meant nothing at all. There were defensive wounds on Carol's body. She had fought back. This little girl had tried to fight off her attacker and she had lost. Investigators also saw something else on Carol's body. Small, synthetic green fibers on her clothing. Fibers that didn't match anything she owned. They were transferred from somewhere, a cart maybe, a blanket, the interior of a car. They didn't know. But they collected those fibers and filed them away, not knowing yet that those same green fibers would appear again and again. Carol Spinks was buried. Her family was devastated. Her twin sister Carolyn would later describe those days as the worst of her life. She felt like she was losing her mind. She couldn't eat. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't function. Her other half, her mirror image, was gone, and the person who took her was still out there somewhere walking free. At the time, police treated Carol's murder as an isolated incident. Tragic, horrifying, yes, but a one-time event, a random act of violence. They had no reason to think otherwise. There was no pattern yet, no connection to make. They investigated, they followed leads, and they came up empty. No witnesses, no suspects, no answers, and life went on. Because that's what happens, doesn't it? The world keeps turning even when yours has stopped. The family grieved. The neighborhood mourned, and slowly, painfully, people try to return to some version of normal. But normal was already gone. They just didn't know it yet. 2 months passed. July rolled in with its heavy, humid air. If you've ever spent a summer in D.C., you know what it feels like. The heat wraps around you like a wet blanket. The air is thick enough to chew. Kids stay outside as long as they can, chasing fire hydrant spray and eating popsicles on front stoops. It was summer. It was supposed to be the best time of the year. Darlinia Denise Johnson was 16 years old. She lived in Congress Heights, the same neighborhood as Carol Spinks. She was a vibrant, outgoing girl with a wide smile and a personality that drew people in. Darlinia had a summer job at the Oxon Hill Recreation Center, and she was looking forward to spending her summer the way 16-year-olds do, working a little, hanging out with friends a lot, and just living her life. She was social. She was fun. She was the kind of teenager who was always surrounded by people, always laughing, always in the middle of something. On 1971, Darlinia set out for her job at the recreation center. She told her mother she might be staying the night with a friend, so when she didn't come home that evening, her family wasn't immediately alarmed. It wasn't until the next day, July 9th, when Darlinia didn't show up for work, that people began to wonder she hadn't called. She hadn't told anyone she wasn't coming. That wasn't like Darlinia. She was responsible about her job. Something was wrong. A missing persons report was filed, and once again the search began. 2 witnesses came forward with conflicting accounts. One said they had seen Darlinia with her boyfriend. The other said they had seen her riding in an older black car driven by an older African-American male. Police followed both leads. Neither went anywhere. Days passed, then a week, then more than a week. And then, on July 19th, 11 days after Darlinia went missing, a police officer received a tip about a body near the freeway. When investigators arrived at the embankment along Interstate 295, they found the remains of a young girl. She was in the same area where Carol Spinks had been found just 2 months before. In fact, the body was only 15 feet away from the exact spot where Carol had been discovered. 15 feet. That's the length of a car. That's how close these 2 dump sites were to each other. But here's something that makes this even more frustrating. Police had actually received an anonymous phone call about a body in that area nearly a week before they went to check. Someone had called in and reported seeing what appeared to be a body near the freeway, and the police had not responded promptly. They had delayed. Days had passed between the call and the actual investigation of the scene. And because of that delay, because of that failure to act, Darlinia's body had been exposed to the brutal July heat for far too long. By the time they got to her, she had been decomposing under the summer sun for nearly 2 weeks. Her remains were so badly deteriorated that a visual identification was impossible. They had to use the clothing found on her body to confirm that it was Darlinia Johnson. She was dressed, just as Carol had been. Her clothes were still on her, but her shoes were gone. Same pattern. Shoes missing, body dumped along the freeway. Young black girl from the same neighborhood. Because of the advanced state of decomposition, the medical examiner couldn't determine whether Darlinia had been sexually assaulted. They couldn't get a definitive cause of death from the physical evidence alone. But they did find signs that were consistent with strangulation. And they noted the location. 15 feet from Carol Spinks. You don't need to be a detective to understand what that means. Whoever killed Darlinia knew exactly where Carol had been left. He returned to the same spot. He placed his second victim almost on top of his first. That's not a coincidence. That's a message. That's someone saying, I'm still here, I'm not done. And you can't stop me. The anonymous caller who had tipped police off about the body was never identified. Think about that. Someone called the police and gave them details about the location of Darlinia's remains. Details that only someone with direct knowledge could have known. The caller knew too much. Police would later believe that the call may have come from the killer himself. Taunting them. Playing with them. Telling them where to find his work and then sitting back to watch as they fumbled the response. And that's exactly what happened. They fumbled it, they delayed, and by the time they found Darlinia, the evidence that might have helped identify her killer had been eaten away by heat and time and the indifference of a system that was not treating these cases with the urgency they demanded. Now, at this point, the family of Carol Spinks felt a terrible mix of grief and hope. Grief, obviously, because another girl was dead, another family was broken, another child had been taken. But hope, because with a second victim, surely now the police would take this seriously. Surely now they would connect the dots. Surely now they would pour resources into the investigation and find whoever was doing this. Carol's older sister, Evander, believed that the discovery of Darlinia's body would be the thing that broke the case open. Finally, she thought, the police would have what they needed. 2 victims, same area, same method. same neighborhood. This was a pattern. This was clearly the work of one person. But the investigation moved slowly. The police were not calling this a serial case. Not yet. They were investigating the two murders, yes, but they weren't publicly acknowledging what the community already knew. Something terrible was happening in Southeast D.C., and the person responsible was still out there. And while the police hesitated, while they debated and delayed and failed to sound the alarm, the clock was already ticking. Because the killer wasn't hesitating, he wasn't debating, he wasn't waiting for permission, he was already hunting again. Just 8 days after Darlinia Johnson's body was found, another girl was July 27, 1971, a Tuesday evening. The sun was going down over northwest D.C., and 10-year-old Brenda Faye Crockett was sent to the grocery store by her mother. The store was close, just a block and a half from their home near Cardozo High School. Brenda was supposed to pick up some bread and dog food. Simple errands. The kind of thing any 10-year-old might be asked to do. She walked out the front door and headed for the store. She never came back. When Brenda didn't return, her mother went out looking for her. She walked the route Brenda would have taken. She checked the store. She asked neighbors. Nothing. No one had seen Brenda. It was as if she had simply evaporated. Brenda's mother left the house to continue searching, leaving Brenda's 7-year-old sister, Bertha, home with their stepfather. And then, about 2 hours after Brenda disappeared, the phone rang. Bertha picked up, and it was Brenda on the other end. She was crying. Her voice was shaky, scared. She told her little sister that a white man had picked her up. She said she thought she was in Virginia. She said the man was going to send her home in a cab, and then abruptly, she said goodbye and hung up. The family didn't know what to make of it. Brenda was alive. That was the good news. But she sounded terrified, and the story she was telling didn't quite add up. A white man, Virginia, a cab. It was confusing and it was frightening. A few minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, Brenda's stepfather answered. It was Brenda again. She repeated what she'd said before. She was in Virginia. A white man had taken her. But then she asked something strange. She said, "Did my mother see me?" Her stepfather was confused. "How could your mother have seen you if you're in Virginia?" The question didn't make sense. Unless Brenda wasn't in Virginia at all. Unless she was still nearby. Unless whoever had taken her had driven past the house, or through the neighborhood, and Brenda had seen her mother out searching, and wondered if her mother had seen her too. The stepfather, sensing the danger, told Brenda to put the man on the phone. There was a pause. Then in the background, the sound of heavy footsteps. Someone was walking, coming closer maybe. And then Brenda's voice, small and quiet, barely a whisper. "I'll see you." The line went dead. Those were the last words anyone in Brenda Crockett's family ever heard her say. "I'll see you." Said in a whisper. Said with the knowledge that something terrible was about to happen. Said by a 10-year-old girl who knew she was in danger and could do nothing to save herself. Investigators would later believe that the phone calls were scripted. That the killer had forced Brenda to make those calls. That he told her what to say. Fed her the story about the white man in Virginia to throw police off his trail. The detail about the white man was almost certainly a misdirection. The killer wanted the police looking for a white suspect, looking in Virginia, wasting time chasing a ghost while what he had already done twice before. But the question Brenda asked, "Did my mother see me?" That wasn't part of any script. That was Brenda. That was a frightened 10-year-old girl, riding in a car with her kidnapper, passing through her own neighborhood, seeing her mother out there in the darkness, searching for her, and wondering, hoping, praying that her mother had looked up at just the right moment and seen her face in the window of a stranger's car. Detective Romaine Jenkins, who would later become one of the lead investigators on the Freeway Phantom case, believed exactly that. She believed that the killer had driven Brenda through her own neighborhood. She believed that Brenda's mother may have actually seen the car, without knowing her daughter was inside it. The thought is agonizing. Your child is right there, feet away from you. And you don't know. You can't see through the guy and crying. You just keep walking, keep searching, keep calling her name into the empty streets, not knowing that she just passed right by you. The next morning, July 28th at 1:50 a.m., a hitchhiker walking along U.S. Route 50 near the Baltimore, Washington Parkway in Prince George's County, Maryland, found the body of Brenda Crockett. She was lying in a conspicuous spot. Not hidden, not buried, just placed there, out in the open for anyone to find. She had been sexually assaulted, she had been strangled. A green scarf was knotted tightly around her neck, the instrument of her death behind like a signature. And once again her shoes were missing, and once again those same mysterious green synthetic fibers were found on her clothing. Brenda Crockett was 10 years old. 10. She was the youngest victim so far, a fourth grader. A little girl who probably still played with dolls, who probably still watched cartoons on Saturday mornings, who probably still believed that the world was a safe place and that bad things happened to other people, not to her. She was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's baby, and she was gone. Now, with 3 victims, the community was screaming. Parents in Southeast and Northwest D.C. were terrified. They were pulling their children off the streets. They were walking them to school, walking them to the store, refusing to let them out of their sight. The neighborhood was gripped by a fear that was unheard ever experienced. This wasn't random violence. This wasn't gang activity or street crime. This was something else entirely, something darker, something more calculated. Someone was specifically targeting young black girls. Someone was snatching them off the streets in broad daylight, or in the early evening, from their own neighborhoods, and killing them. And the police, by all accounts, were not doing enough. Reporters began flooding into the neighborhoods, conducting their own investigations, talking to families, talking to witnesses. Carol Spink's sister Evander would later recall that the news told them more than the police ever did. The families felt abandoned. They felt like the system that was supposed to protect them was failing them. And looking at the facts, it's hard to argue otherwise. 3 girls were dead. All 3 were young. All 3 were black. All 3 were from working-class neighborhoods. All 3 had been abducted while doing something mundane, something routine, something safe, going to the store, walking to work, running an errand. The kind of thing any child in any neighborhood might do on any given day. And all 3 had been dumped along freeways, their shoes taken, their bodies discarded like they didn't matter. And still, the police had no suspects, no leads, no answers. Just 3 dead girls in a community that was beginning to lose faith. But the killer wasn't finished. He was just getting started. Because what happened next in the weeks and months that followed would reveal just how bold, how calculating, and how utterly merciless the Freeway Phantom truly was. The body count was about to rise. The pattern was about to become undeniable. And the investigation was about to become one of the most frustrating, most heartbreaking failures in the history of American law enforcement. October 1st, 1971. It had been just over 2 months since Brenda Crockett's body was found on Route 50. 2 months since a 10-year-old girl whispered her last words into a telephone and disappeared forever. 2 months of fear, of vigilance, of parents gripping their children's hands a little tighter every time they walked out the front door. 2 months of the community waiting, watching, wondering if it was over. Maybe the killer had moved on. Maybe he'd been arrested for something else. Maybe the police were closing in and the pressure had scared him off. People needed to believe that. They needed to hold on to the idea that the worst was behind them, because the alternative was too terrifying to accept. But the Freeway Phantom hadn't gone anywhere. He was still in Washington, D.C. He was still watching, still choosing. And on the evening of October 1st, he chose again. Nenomasha Yates was 12 years old. Her family called her Nin. She was a quiet, shy girl. A 6th grader at Kelly Miller Junior High School. She wasn't the loud kid in the class. She wasn't the one cracking jokes or causing trouble. She was the kind of child who kept to herself, who observed the world from a careful distance, who had a gentleness about her that made people want to protect her. She was small, like the other victims before her, and she lived in the 4900 block of Benning Road in Northeast D.C., in an apartment with her family just steps away from the Safeway grocery store. On the evening of October 1st, sometime around 7 o'clock, Nenomasha's father sent her to that Safeway to pick up a few things. Sugar, flour, paper plates, basic household items. The store was less than a block away. You could practically see it from her front door. It was the kind of errand that would take 5 minutes, maybe 10. Walk to the store, grab the items, walk home. That's all it was supposed to be. A clerk at the Safeway would later confirm that Nenomashia came into the store, purchased her items, and left. She was seen walking out the front door with her bag of groceries. Everything was normal. Everything was fine, and then it wasn't. Sometime between walking out of that Safeway and reaching her apartment, less than a block away, Nenomashia Yates was taken. She vanished so quickly, so completely that no one saw it happen. One moment she was there, a 12-year-old girl carrying a bag of sugar and paper plates, and the next she was gone later. A Safeway employee found the items she had purchased scattered on the ground outside the store. The bag had been dropped or thrown, or knocked from her hands. The groceries were just lying there on the sidewalk, abandoned, as if whoever was carrying them had been snatched into thin air. There was one witness who came forward later. Someone reported seeing Nenomashia getting into a blue Volkswagen. Police investigated that lead, but it went nowhere. No license plate. No description of the driver beyond vague details. Another dead end. Another thread that led to nothing. Less than 3 hours later, a teenager walking along the shoulder of Pennsylvania Avenue in Prince George's County, Maryland, made a grim discovery. Lying in the grass just off the road was the body of a young girl. When the teenager got closer, he realized the body was still warm. She hadn't been dead long, in fact. Based on the condition of the remains, Nenomashia Yates had been alive just a short time before she was found. The gap between her abduction and her death was heartbreakingly small. Unlike Carol Spinks, who had been held captive for days, Nenomashia's ordeal had been compressed into hours. Whatever this man did to her, he did it quickly. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been strangled. Her shoes were missing. And once again, those same unidentified green synthetic fibers were found on her clothing. The same fibers that had been found on Carol Spinks. The same fibers found on Brenda Crockett. The same mysterious green threads that kept appearing on body after body, linking these crimes together like a ribbon of horror. Nenomashia Yates, 12 years old. A quiet girl who liked to keep to herself. A girl who was sent to buy sugar and paper plates from a store she could see from her own front door. And she never made it home. It was with the murder of Nenomashia Yates that the pieces finally, undeniably, came together. 4 young black girls, all abducted from their neighborhoods. All strangled. All dumped along major roads and freeways. All missing their shoes. All found with those same green fibers. This was not a series of unrelated tragedies. This was not a coincidence. This was the work of one person. One predator. One killer who was specifically, deliberately, systematically hunting young black girls in Washington, D.C. After Nenomashia's murder, the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department officially acknowledged what the community had been screaming for months. These cases were connected. They were dealing with what they called a repeat offender. The FBI was brought into the investigation. A joint task force was assembled, pulling together detectives from the D.C. Metropolitan Police, investigators from Prince George's County, Maryland State Police, and FBI agents. Resources were finally being allocated. Attention was finally being paid. But it was late. It was so painfully, tragically late. 4 girls were already dead. 4 families were already destroyed. 4 children were already in the ground. And the man who put them there was still free. It was also after Nenomashia's murder that the media gave the killer his name. A reporter at the Daily News, a now defunct D.C. tabloid, wrote a story about the murders and noted the common thread that connected them. All of the victims' bodies had been found along major roads and freeways. The highways of the nation's capital had become this killer's dumping ground, his calling card, his signature. And so the reporter coined a phrase that would become infamous. He called the unknown murderer the Freeway Phantom. The Freeway Phantom. The name stuck. Every newspaper in the region picked it up. Every television news broadcast used it. It became shorthand for the terror that was gripping the city. A 2-word summary of everything that had gone wrong. Everything that was still going wrong. Everything that no one seemed able to stop. And the killer, whoever he was, took notice. He heard the name. He read the headlines, and something shifted inside him. Whether it was the attention, the notoriety, or something else entirely, the Freeway Phantom became bolder after that, more confident, more brazen. 6 weeks passed after Nenomashia's murder. 6 weeks of heightened patrols, of FBI profilers trying to build a picture of the killer, of detectives knocking on doors and chasing leads that went nowhere. The community was on edge. Parents were walking their children everywhere. Nobody was sending kids to the store alone anymore. The era of letting your children roam free in the neighborhood was over. The Freeway Phantom had taken that too, along with everything else. And then, on November 15, 1971, he struck again. Brenda Denise Woodard was 18 years old. She was the oldest of the Freeway Phantom's victims, though she was still young. Still just barely on the threshold of adulthood. Brenda was a high school student who lived on Maryland Avenue. She was smart, she was social. And on the evening of November 15th, she had gone to have dinner with a classmate. It was a normal night. Two friends, sharing a meal, talking about the things high schoolers talk about: classes, friends, plans for the future. The kind of evening that happens a million times a day in a million different places and never ends in tragedy. After dinner, sometime around 11:30 at night, Brenda boarded a city bus to head home. She was seen getting off at one stop to transfer to another bus. Her friends saw her there, at the transfer point near 8th and H Street. She waved. They waved back. And that was the last time anyone who loved Brenda Woodard ever saw her alive. What happened next is unclear. Somewhere between that bus stop and her home, Brenda was taken. She either got into a car willingly, possibly because the driver seemed trustworthy or offered her a ride, or she was forced. The details have never been established. All we know is that Brenda Woodard never made it home that night. Approximately 6 hours later, in the early morning hours of November 16th, a police officer discovered a body in a grassy area near Prince George's County Hospital, along an access ramp to Route 22 from the Baltimore-Washington Parkway. It was Brenda. She had been strangled. But unlike the other victims, she had also been stabbed. Multiple times. The level of violence had escalated. Whatever rage or composing this killer, it was getting worse. There were other differences too. Unlike the previous victims, Brenda was still wearing her shoes. That broke the pattern. Every other girl had been found without her shoes, and the missing shoes had become one of the defining signatures of the Freeway Phantom. But this time the shoes were there, and there was something else. A coat had been placed over Brenda's chest, almost as if someone had covered her up. It was an odd detail, one that detectives struggled to interpret. Was it a sign of remorse? Was the killer feeling guilt? Was he trying to preserve some final shred of dignity for the girl he had just murdered? Or was it something else entirely? A calculated act designed attention to what was hidden underneath, because there was something underneath that coat. In one of the pockets, investigators found a note. A handwritten note. And when they read it, the room went quiet. The note read, "This is tantamount to my insensitivity to people, especially women. I will admit the others where you catch me if you can." It was signed Y. Phantom. I want you to read that again. Think about those words. Think about the arrogance behind them. Think about the cold, calculating mind that composed that message while sitting next to the body of an 18-year-old girl he had just strangled and stabbed to death. He wasn't remorseful. He wasn't hiding. He was taunting. He was bragging. He was daring the police to catch him. Now, here's what made this note even more disturbing. The handwriting wasn't the killer's, it was Brenda's. Forensic analysts compared the writing to samples of Brenda Woodard's handwriting and confirmed that she had written the note herself. The paper had been cut from Brenda's own school notebook, which meant that at some point during her captivity, at some point during those final hours of her life, the Freeway Phantom had sat Brenda Woodard down and dictated that message to her. He made her write it word by word, letter by letter. He told her what to say, and she put it down on paper in her own handwriting, knowing that she was writing the words of the man who was about to kill her. Think about what that means. Think about the psychological torture of that moment. You're 18 years old. You're sitting across from a man who has already hurt you, who you know is going to kill you, and he's telling you to write a message. A message that celebrates his own cruelty. A message that mocks the police for not catching him. A message that uses your hand, your pen, your notebook, your words to announce his own depravity to the world. And you write it. Because what choice do you have? Because maybe, somewhere in the back of your mind, you're hoping that if you do what he says, he'll let you go. Maybe if you cooperate, you'll survive. Maybe this will be enough for him. Maybe he just wants to make his point, and then he'll open the door and let you walk away. But he didn't let her walk away. He never intended to. The note was just another piece of his game, another move on the chessboard, another way to demonstrate his power, his control, his complete dominance over these young girls and over the police who were trying to find him. The word tantamount jumped out at investigators immediately. It's not a common word. It's not the kind of word most people use in everyday conversation. It's an educated word, a deliberate word, the kind of word someone would use if they wanted to demonstrate their intelligence, their vocabulary, their superiority. Detectives noted it and filed it away. They would return to that word later, years later, when a suspect emerged who was known to use that exact word with unusual frequency. The note also had odd capitalizations throughout. Certain letters were capitalized randomly, seemingly without reason. Some investigators wondered if there was a hidden message embedded in the capitalizations, a code of some kind that the killer was using to communicate something beyond the surface meaning of the words. Others believed the irregular capitalizations were simply the result of Brenda's handwriting style, or her state of mind while writing under extreme duress. A girl being forced to write a killer's message with shaking hands and tears in her eyes is not going to produce perfect penmanship. The truth is, no one has ever been able to definitively determine whether the capitalizations were intentional or accidental. It remains one of the many small, maddening mysteries within the larger mystery of the Freeway Phantom. After Brenda Woodard's murder, something changed. Whether it was the increased police presence, the FBI's involvement, the media attention, or some internal shift within the killer himself, the murders stopped. November passed. December, January, February. Spring came and went, summer arrived. The city held its breath. Months went by without another abduction, without another body found along the freeway. And slowly, cautiously, people began to hope again. Maybe it was over. Maybe the Freeway Phantom had been scared off by the task force, by the publicity, by the weight of his own crimes. Maybe he had left the city, or being arrested for something else, or simply stopped. Maybe the nightmare was finally mercifully over. But hope in this case was a cruel thing, because the Freeway Phantom hadn't stopped, he was just waiting. For 10 months he waited. 10 months of nothing. And then on September 5, 1972, he came back. Diane Denise Williams was 17 years old. She was a senior at Ballow High School in Southeast D.C. She was bright, she was loved, and she had plans for her future that extended far beyond the neighborhood she grew up in. On the evening of September 5th, a Tuesday, Diane did what she always did. She cooked dinner for her family. She was that kind of teenager, the responsible one, the one who took care of the people around her, the one who stepped up without being asked. After dinner, she went to visit her boyfriend. It was a school night, so she couldn't stay long, but she wanted to see him. They spent a few hours together, just being teenagers, talking, laughing, being in love the way only 17-year-olds can be. When it was time to go home, her boyfriend walked her to the bus stop. It was near Martin Luther King Jr. Avenue in Southeast. This was the same area, the same neighborhood, where Carol Spinks and Darlinia Johnson had been abducted more than a year earlier. The Freeway Phantom was returning to familiar ground. Diane was last seen boarding a city bus at around 11:20 at night. Her boyfriend watched her get on. He kissed her goodbye, and then he turned and walked home, not knowing that he had just said goodbye to her for the last time. Diane Williams never made it home. Her sister Patricia would later remember that night with haunting clarity. She remembered lying in bed waiting for Diane to come through the door. She remembered the hours ticking by. She remembered the fear creeping in. The way it starts in your stomach and spreads up into your chest. The growing certainty that something is wrong even though you're trying yourself, it's fine. She's just running late. She'll be home any minute. Patricia remembered how hard it was to fall asleep, knowing that her sister was out there somewhere and not knowing where. The next morning, September 6th, a truck driver pulled over along Interstate 295, just south of the district line, and found the body of Diane Williams. She was lying on the side of the freeway, less than 2 miles from her home. She had been strangled. Her body was clothed, but her shoes were missing. The pattern was back. The signature was unmistakable, but there were some differences with Diane's case. Unlike most of the other victims, there was no evidence of sexual assault. There were traces of semen found on her body. But investigators believed those were from consensual contact with her boyfriend earlier that evening. The freeway phantom had strangled her, had taken her shoes, had dumped her along the freeway. But he hadn't assaulted her sexually. Why the change? Had something interrupted him? Had he been in a hurry? Or was the killing itself enough for him by this point? Had the act of taking a life become the primary thrill, rendering everything else unnecessary? Those green synthetic fibers were found on Diane's clothing as well. The same fibers. The same thread connecting all 6 victims across 18 months and multiple jurisdictions. Whatever those fibers came from, whether it was a car interior, a carpet blanket, a piece of furniture, it was something the killer owned, something that was a consistent part of his environment, something that left its trace on every single girl he murdered. And then something happened that added another layer of cruelty to an already unbearable situation. The Williams family received a phone call. A man's voice, cold, direct. He told them, "I killed your daughter. That's it. No explanation, no reason, no motive. Just those 4 words. I killed your." Line went dead. The phone call was never traced. In 1972, there was no caller ID. There was no way to track a phone call after the fact unless a tap was already in place. The technology simply didn't exist. And so the voice on the other end of the line remained just another phantom. Another ghost in a case that was already full of them. Whether that call actually came from the freeway phantom has never been definitively established. It's possible it was a cruel hoax, a sick prank by someone who had read about the murders in the newspaper and decided to torment a grieving family for sport. But the families of other victims reported receiving similar calls. Threatening calls, taunting calls, calls from a deep-voiced man who seemed to know details about the crimes. A community organizer named Dorothy Wheeler, who had organized a search party after Carol Spink's disappearance, had also received threatening calls and letters from someone claiming to be the killer. The voice told her that if she didn't stop her involvement, her own daughters would end up on the side of the road. Whoever was making these calls knew things. They knew details about the families, about the victims, about the community. It felt personal, it felt targeted, and it felt like the freeway phantom was enjoying himself. 6 victims, 6 young black girls, 6 families shattered beyond repair, and across all of it, a pattern that was as clear as it was disturbing. Let me lay it out for you. Every single one of these girls was young, black, and female. Their ages ranged from 10 to 18, but most of them were in their early teens. They were all small, petite, with similar builds. They were all abducted from their own neighborhoods while doing something completely ordinary. Walking to the store, going to work, riding the bus, running an errand. They were taken from the streets in plain sight, which means the killer was either someone they trusted enough to get into a car with, or he was so smooth, so disarming, so seemingly harmless that they didn't see the danger until it was too late. Every victim was strangled. Most were sexually assaulted. Most had their shoes taken. Most were found with those same green fibers on their clothing. And all of their bodies were dumped along major roads and freeways, primarily along Interstate 295 and its surrounding highway system. The freeway was his disposal route, his escape corridor, his signature. He used the roads that cut through the heart of D.C., the way a river cuts through a valley, carrying his victims away from where they were taken and depositing them along the banks of asphalt and concrete where they would eventually be found. The killer knew the area. He knew the neighborhoods. He knew the roads. He knew which freeways to use, which exits to take, which stretches of highway were dark and empty and unlikely to have witnesses. He moved through the city like a appearing and disappearing without leaving a trace. And despite 4 of the 6 victims being found in Prince George's County, Maryland, while 2 were found within the District of Columbia itself, the jurisdictional overlap created a maze of bureaucratic confusion. Different police departments, different evidence systems, different detectives working different pieces of the same puzzle without always knowing what the other pieces looked like. Communication between agencies was slow and cumbersome. There was no email, no shared databases, no instant way to compare notes. Everything had to be done by phone or in person, which meant that information fell through the cracks. Leads were missed. Connections were overlooked. The killer operated in the seams between jurisdictions, and those seams became his shield. The community, meanwhile, was breaking. Parents in Southeast and Northeast D.C. were living in a state of constant terror. Mothers who had once let their children play outside until dark were now keeping them inside with the doors locked. Fathers who had once sent their kids to the corner store were now making the trips themselves. The simple, everyday freedoms of childhood had been stolen, not just from the victims, but from every child in the neighborhood. The Freeway Phantom had poisoned the entire community. He had taken the trust, the safety, the sense of security that had defined these tight-knit neighborhoods and replaced it with fear. Raw, unrelenting, paralyzing fear, and through it all, the families of the victims felt a growing sense of abandonment. They watched the news, they read the papers, and they saw, with increasing bitterness, that the rest of the country didn't seem to care. These were black girls from working-class neighborhoods. They weren't the kind of victims who made national headlines. They weren't the kind of victims who inspired the kind of massive, round-the-clock, no-expense-spared investigations that other cases seemed to generate. There was a feeling, a justified and painful feeling, that if these had been white girls from wealthy families, the story would have been front-page news across the country. If these had been blonde-haired, blue-eyed daughters of senators and CEOs, the FBI would have had 50 agents on the case instead of a handful. If these had been the children of the powerful, the machinery of justice would have moved heaven and earth to find the killer, but they weren't. They were the daughters of janitors and bus drivers and hairdressers and factory workers. They were the children of the other DC, the invisible DC, the DC that existed behind the monuments and the marble. And their deaths, while devastating to their families and their communities, barely registered in the national consciousness. Leon Williams, the father of Diane Williams, the 6th and final victim, would later say it plainly. He told the Washington Post that if his daughter had been white, the police would have found the person. He said he didn't believe the police had followed the leads they had. He questioned why they assumed the killer was black and why they weren't investigating white suspects. His words were raw, angry, and heartbroken, and they spoke to a truth that has echoed through American crime for decades. The value of a victim in the eyes of the system is too often determined by the color of their skin and the size of their bank account. Carol Spinks' sister Evander put it even more bluntly. She said that if these had been white girls, the police would have solved the cases. Period. End of story. No uncertainty, no ambiguity, just a flat, devastating statement of fact from a woman who had watched her 13-year-old sister get murdered and then watched the system fail to deliver justice. And they were right. The investigation was flawed from the beginning. The slow response to the discovery of Darlinia Johnson's body, the failure to immediately connect the first 2 murders, the lack of urgency in the early stages, the jurisdictional confusion, the communication breakdowns. Every step of the way there were failures, not just failures of policing but failures of will, failures of priority, failures of a system that simply did not value these victims the way it should have. But there were people within that system who tried. There were detectives who cared, who worked late nights and early mornings, who carried these cases with them long after the files were closed. One of the detectives was a woman named Romaine Jenkins. Jenkins was one of the first female homicide detectives in D.C. She was black, she was from the community, and she took the Freeway Phantom case personally, not because she was unprofessional, but because she understood what these deaths meant. She understood the weight they carried. She understood the pain of the families, and the fear of the neighborhoods, and the injustice of a system that was content to let black girls die without answers. Jenkins would work the Freeway Phantom case for years. She would reopen it, reinvestigate it, fight for it when others had moved on. She became the case's most dedicated advocate within the department, the one person who refused to let it slide into obscurity. And while she would never solve it, her commitment kept the case alive during years when it might otherwise have been forgotten entirely. But in the fall of 1972, with 6 girls dead and no suspects in custody, the investigation was already losing momentum. The task force met. Detectives reviewed evidence. FBI profilers tried to build a psychological portrait of the killer. But there were no breakthroughs, no confessions, no smoking gun. The Freeway Phantom had left behind just enough evidence to haunt the investigators, but not enough to identify him. He was careful, he was smart, and he was gone. After Diane Williams' murder in September of 1972, the killings stopped. Just like that. No more abductions. No more bodies along the freeway. No more phone calls in the middle of the night. The Freeway Phantom vanished as suddenly and as completely as his victims had. One day he was there, a shadow moving through the streets of D.C., and the next day he was gone. Whether he moved away, whether he died, whether he was arrested for something else, whether he simply decided he was done, no one knew. And no one knows to this day. The silence should have been a relief. And in some ways, it was. Parents could breathe a little easier. Children could walk to the store again. The grip of terror loosened slowly, reluctantly, the way a fist unclenches after being closed for too long. But for the families of the 6 victims, the silence was just another form of cruelty. Because the silence meant the case was going cold. The silence meant the trail was getting colder. The silence meant that with every passing day, every passing month, the chances of catching the Freeway Phantom were getting smaller and smaller. And in the years that followed, those chances would shrink to almost nothing. Because what happened to this investigation over the next several decades is a story of institutional failure that would make what came before look like a warm-up. Evidence was lost. Files were misplaced. Detectives retired or died. The case was opened and closed and opened again, passed from hand to hand like a burden no one wanted to carry. And at the center of it all, 6 girls remained without justice. Their killer remained without a name, and the Freeway Phantom remained exactly what he had always been, a ghost. Now, in the months and years that followed the last murder, the investigation entered a new phase. With no active killings to respond to, detectives shifted from crisis mode to long-term investigation. They had evidence, they had patterns. They had witness statements and fiber samples and the handwritten note from Brenda Woodard's pocket. What they needed was a suspect. Someone who fit the profile. Someone who had access to the neighborhoods, knowledge of the roads, and the kind of personality that could lure young girls into a car and murder them without leaving a trace. The police began working through lists. Known sex offenders, convicted rapists, men with histories of violence against women and girls. They cross-referenced these names with the neighborhoods where the abductions had occurred, with the routes the killer had used to dump the bodies, with every scrap of information they had. And in doing so, they would eventually identify several persons of interest, several suspects who seemed to fit the profile in one way or another. But before we get to the suspects, before we get to the names and the theories and the tantalizing what-ifs, I want to pause for a moment. Because this case isn't really about the suspects. It's not really about the investigation. It's about the victims. It's about Carol Spinks, who was 13 years old and loved to play games with her brothers and sisters. It's about Darlinia Johnson, who was 16 and had a summer job and a smile that could light up a room. It's about Brenda Crockett, who was 10 years old and called her family from a stranger's phone to say she was coming home when she knew she wasn't. It's about Nenamashi Yates, who was 12 and quiet and shy and was sent to buy sugar from a store she could see from her front door. It's about Brenda Woodard, who was 18 and smart and wrote a killer's words in her own handwriting because she had no other choice. And it's about Diane Williams, who was 17 and cooked dinner for her family and kissed her boyfriend goodbye at a bus stop and never came home. These were real people, real girls, real lives that were cut short by someone who saw them as nothing more than objects to be used and discarded. And the fact that their killer was never caught, that their families never got answers, that the system that was supposed to protect them failed at every turn, is not just a tragedy. It's an indictment. It's an indictment of the way this country values certain lives over others. It's an indictment of a justice system that moves heaven and earth for some victims and barely lifts a finger for others. And it's an indictment of a society that allowed 6 children to be murdered in the nation's capital, and then slowly, quietly, forgot about them. But we're not going to forget about them tonight. We're going to keep going. We're going to talk about the suspects, the theories, the investigation that stumbled and stalled and started again. We're going to talk about the men whose names came up again and again in connection with these crimes, and we're going to examine the evidence that pointed to them and the reasons why none of them were ever charged. The investigation into the Freeway Phantom murders was, from the very beginning, a study in frustration. You have to understand what the police were working with, or more accurately, what they weren't working with. This was the early 1970s. There was no DNA testing. There were no computerized databases. There was no internet, no cell phone tracking, no surveillance cameras on every corner. The tools that modern investigators take for granted simply didn't exist. Detectives were working with shoe leather and notebooks, knocking on doors, interviewing witnesses, collecting physical evidence by hand, and sending it to labs that were overworked and understaffed. Everything was slow. Everything was manual. And in a case where the killer left almost nothing behind, that meant everything was frustrating. What did they have? They had the green fibers. Those mysterious green synthetic carpet fibers that had been found on 5 of the 6 victims' clothing. Forensic analysts determined that the fibers were consistent with indoor-outdoor carpeting, the kind that might be found in a home, an office, or the interior of a vehicle. But in the early 1970s, fiber analysis was in its infancy. They could tell you what kind of fiber it was. They could tell you approximately what it might have come from. But they couldn't tell you where it was manufactured, who bought it, or where it was installed. The fibers were a clue, but a maddeningly vague one. They pointed in a direction, but that direction was too broad to be useful. They had the note from Brenda Woodard's pocket. The handwriting had been confirmed as hers, but the words were the killer's. The word, tantamount, was unusual enough to be noteworthy, but it wasn't enough to identify anyone. They had the phone calls, both the ones Brenda Crockett was forced to make and the threatening calls made to victims' families and to community organizer Dorothy Wheeler. But without caller ID or phone tracing technology, those calls were ghosts. Voices in the dark that couldn't be pinned to a person or a place. They had witness statements, but they were contradictory and unreliable. One person said they saw Darlinia Johnson with her boyfriend. Another said she was in an older black car with an older black male. A witness claimed to have seen Nenemasha Yates getting into a blue Volkswagen. None of these leads panned out. The descriptions didn't match each other. The vehicles were different. The details were fuzzy. Witnesses in cases like this are often well-meaning but unreliable, especially when the events they're recalling happen quickly, in low light, and at a distance. And they had something else. Something that should have been helpful but instead became one of the investigation's most damaging distractions. They had the Angela Barnes case. Angela Denise Barnes was 14 years old. On July 13, 1971, her body was found alongside Maryland State Highway 23. She had been shot to death. The timing was suspicious. Barnes was found dead in the middle of the Freeway Phantom's killing spree, between the murders of Darlinia Johnson and Brenda Crockett. She was a young black girl, found near a highway, in the same general area where the Phantom was operating. On the surface, it looked like she could be another victim. Police initially included her in the Freeway Phantom case file. But Angela Barnes was not a victim of the Freeway Phantom. Her murder, while horrific, was a separate crime entirely. 2 men would eventually be arrested and convicted for her killing. Their names were Edward Leonard Selman and Tommy Bernard Simmons. Both were former probationary police officers. Selman, 30 years old, had worked as a police officer before retiring. Simmons, 26, had served for about 8 months before leaving the force. These two ex-cops were convicted of murdering Angela Barnes, and authorities eventually confirmed that her death was not connected to the Freeway Phantom series. But before that determination was made, valuable time and resources were spent investigating the Barnes case as part of the Phantom series. Detectives were pulled in different directions. Leads were muddied. The already scattered investigation became even more fragmented, and meanwhile the real Freeway Phantom continued to operate without interference. This is one of the cruelest aspects of serial killer investigations. The more victims there are, the more leads there are. The more leads there are, the more stretched the investigators become. Every tip, every phone call, every witness statement has to be run down. Every suspicious person has to be checked out. And when cases that aren't connected get lumped together, the whole thing becomes a tangled mess of dead ends and false starts. The Angela Barnes case was one such dead end. It consumed time and energy that could have been directed at the real Phantom, and by the time it was sorted out, the trail had grown even colder. Now, as the months and years passed after the last known murder, the investigation entered what might best be described as a revolving door of suspects and theories. Detectives developed more than 100 potential suspects over the course of the investigation. They combed through the rosters of local mental health facilities. They ran background checks on substitute teachers who might have had contact with the victims. They looked at recreation center workers. Given that the first victim's body was found near St. Elizabeth's Hospital, and that several victims had connections to local recreation programs, they examined the employment records of anyone who worked in or around the neighborhoods where the abductions occurred. Doctors, bus drivers, postal workers, military personnel. Everyone was a potential suspect, and none of them panned out, but 3 suspects or groups of suspects would eventually rise above the noise. 3 names or sets of names that investigators would return to again and again over the decades that followed, and each one represents a different kind of investigative failure. The first was the Green Vega rapists. Now, I need you to understand who these people were, because their connection to the Freeway Phantom case is complicated and ultimately deeply frustrating. The Green Vega rapists were a gang that operated in Washington, D.C., and the surrounding Maryland area during the same time period as the Freeway Phantom murders. They got their name from the car they drove, a green Chevrolet Vega. The gang was made up of 5 or 6 men, most of whom had met at Kelly Miller Junior High School and later attended Spingarn High School, though most of them dropped out before graduating. These men were responsible for a staggering number of crimes. They kidnapped and raped women throughout the D.C. area, operating along the Washington Beltway. Their crimes were brutal, systematic, and prolific. Some estimates suggest they may have been responsible for hundreds of sexual assaults. They were predators of the worst kind, and they were operating in the same neighborhoods, during the same time frame as the Freeway Phantom. The overlap was too significant to ignore. Here was a gang of violent sexual predators, active in the same area, targeting women and girls, during the exact same period when 6 young black girls were being abducted and murdered. Some of their abductions took place only blocks away from where the Phantom's victims had been kidnapped. The logical question was obvious. Were the Green Vega rapists responsible for the Freeway Phantom murders? The police certainly thought it was worth investigating. In the early to mid-1970s, after the gang members had been arrested and convicted on their rape charges, detectives from the MPDC Homicide Division went to Lorton Prison in Virginia, where the gang members were serving their sentences, and began conducting interviews. They spoke to the members individually, trying to get one of them to crack, to implicate the others, to provide the breakthrough that would finally solve the Phantom case. And one of them did talk. His name was Morris Joseph Warren, and he was known in the gang by the nickname Fetsy. Warren was the first to crack, motivated not by guilt but by self-preservation. He was afraid that one of the other gang members would rat him out first, and he wanted to get ahead of it. He agreed to cooperate with investigators, but only under the condition that his name would be kept confidential. He didn't want the other gang members to know he was talking. He feared retaliation. The investigators agreed to his terms. Throughout late May of 1974, Morris Warren began feeding information to the detectives. He talked about the Freeway Phantom crimes. He implicated specific members of the Green Vega gang. He gave details about dates, times, and locations. According to investigators at the time, Warren was providing information that went beyond what had been reported in the media. He seemed to know things that only someone with inside knowledge would know. For the first time in the investigation, it felt like they were getting somewhere. It felt like the wall was crumbling. It felt like, after years of dead ends and false starts, they were finally closing in on the truth. And then a politician ruined everything. Arthur A. Marshall Jr. was the Prince George's County State's attorney. He was running for re-election, and he saw an opportunity. In the middle of the investigation, Marshall went public with the news that a breakthrough had occurred in the Freeway Phantom case. He told the press that an inmate at Lorton Prison had provided key information. He didn't name Morris Warren directly, but it didn't matter. The information was specific enough that anyone inside Lorton could figure out who was talking. The consequences were immediate and devastating. Morris Warren panicked. He knew that the other gang members would figure out he was the informant. He knew what happened to snitches in prison. He began making unrealistic demands of the investigators and prosecutors. He started backtracking, hedging, changing his story. And then, to make matters worse, John Davis, one of the other gang members, figured out what was happening. He wrote letters to Morris, demanding to know what he had told the police. The correspondence spooked Morris completely. On August 29, 1974, Morris Warren officially recanted everything. He denied having any information about the Freeway Phantom. He said he had made it all up. He refused to cooperate any further. And just like that, the most promising lead in the entire investigation evaporated. Months of work, hours of interviews, pages of notes, all of it gone, because a politician couldn't keep his mouth shut. Now, the question remained. Was Morris Warren telling the truth when he implicated his fellow gang members? Or was he lying from the start, fabricating a story to try to cut a deal for himself? Investigators were divided. Some believed Warren had genuine inside knowledge. He had provided details that seemed to go beyond what was publicly available. He had been specific about certain facts that only someone connected to the crimes would know. On the other hand, other investigators pointed out that all of the information Warren provided could have been gleaned from newspaper articles and media coverage of the murders. Warren hadn't mentioned the note found in Brenda Woodard's pocket, a detail that had been kept out of the press. If he truly had insider knowledge, wouldn't he have known about the note? The omission was damning. In the years that followed, the FBI re-interviewed members of the Green Vega gang and their associates. Several of them admitted that the whole thing had been a hoax. They said the gang members had cooked up the story, planning to trade fabricated information about the Freeway Phantom for lighter sentences or prison privileges. They were playing the system, and for a while it worked. Until it didn't. Most investigators today do not believe the Green Vega rapists were responsible for Phantom murders. The gang was certainly dangerous. They were certainly capable of horrific violence. But the Freeway Phantom murders had a signature, a pattern, a level of organization and discipline that didn't match the gang's typical behavior. The Phantom worked alone. He was meticulous. He left almost no evidence behind. The Green Vega rapists, by contrast, were a group. They were sloppy, they left witnesses, they got caught. The two profiles didn't align, but the Green Vega investigation had consumed an enormous amount of time and resources. It had dominated the task force's attention for years. And while detectives were focused on Lorton Prison, chasing a lead that would ultimately amount to nothing, the real killer's trail was growing colder by the day. It was a catastrophic distraction, made worse by political grandstanding and media leaks, and it may have cost the investigation its best chance at solving the case. The second major suspect was far more compelling, and far more disturbing. Robert Elwood Askins was by any measure one of the most dangerous men in Washington, D.C. history. His criminal career spanned decades and left a trail of violence against women that was staggering in its brutality and consistency. If there was ever a person who seemed capable of being the Freeway Phantom, It was Robert Askins. Let me tell you about this man. Because his story reads like a horror novel, except every word of it is true. In December of 1938, Robert Askins was 19 years old. He was a student at Minor Teachers College in Washington, D.C., and a member of the school's science club. He was intelligent, he was articulate, and he harbored a deep, pathological hatred of women that had been festering inside him for years. On December 20th, 1938, Askins went to a brothel in D.C. He brought with him a bottle of whiskey. But this wasn't ordinary whiskey. Askins, using the chemistry knowledge he had gained in his science club, had laced the bottle with potassium cyanide. He offered the whiskey to 5 sex workers at the brothel. He poured drinks for each of them and then, with a smile, proposed a toast. He placed his wallet on the table and told the women he'd give a reward to whoever drink the whiskey fastest. One of the women, a 31-year-old named Ruth McDonald, drank the entire glass in one gulp. The others tasted it and spat it out. Within hours, Ruth McDonald was dead, poisoned by a 19-year-old college student who had decided, on that winter night, to begin his war against women. But Askins wasn't finished. Just 2 days later, on December 30th, he returned to the same brothel and stabbed to death a 26-year-old sex worker named Elizabeth Johnson. 2 women dead in 2 days, both killed at the same location. Both killed by the same man. When Askins was arrested, he told the police something that would define him for the rest of his life. He declared that he was a woman hater. Those were his words. Not the police's interpretation. Not a psychological assessment. His own self-description, delivered with what witnesses described as calm, almost proud certainty he hated women. He wanted to kill them. And he was telling the world. Askins was placed under mental observation at Gallinger Hospital in D.C. While there, he broke free of his restraints and attacked 3 orderlies with a chair before being subdued. The man was dangerous even in captivity, even when restrained, even when surrounded by people whose job it was to contain him. During his trial, an interesting detail emerged. Askins had been working as a police informant prior to his crimes. He had been helping law enforcement arrest sex workers. The irony is sickening. Here was a man who helped the police arrest women, while simultaneously plotting to murder them. He was embedded in the system, trusted by law enforcement, and using that trust to get closer to the women he despised. In April of 1939, Askins was found criminally insane and committed to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, the same psychiatric facility near where Carol Spink's body would be found more than 3 decades later. He was held at St. Elizabeth's for 13 years. 13 years in a mental institution. And then, in April of 1952, he was released. 5 months later, Askins strangled a 42-year-old woman named Laura Cook to death. 5 months. That's all the time he needed. Less than half a year of freedom, and he killed again. The hatred hadn't diminished during his 13 years of institutionalization. The violence hadn't been treated or cured or contained. It had been sitting there waiting, like a fire smoldering under ash. Askins was indicted for Laura Cook's murder in 1954. He was also accused of several other assaults against women during this period. He was retried for the 1938 murder of Ruth McDonald after it was determined that he had actually been legally sane at the time of the crime. Despite claiming that the cyanide had been intended for his own suicide, a jury convicted him of second-degree murder and sentenced him to 20 years to life. But here's where the system failed again. In 1958, Askins' conviction was overturned on a technicality related to the statute of limitations. He was freed, released back into society. A man who had poisoned 1 woman, stabbed another to death, strangled a 3rd, attacked orderlies in a hospital, and declared himself a woman hater was put back on the streets of Washington, D.C. For the next 20 or so years, Askins appeared to live a relatively quiet life. He got a job as a computer technician at the National Science Foundation. He lived in Arrows in northeast D.C. To his neighbors and co-workers, he seemed like an ordinary, amiable man. A little eccentric, maybe. He had a habit of using certain words with unusual frequency. One of those words was tantamount. His colleagues noticed it because it stood out. It's not a word most people drop into casual conversation. But Askins used it regularly, almost like a verbal tic, a word he was fond of, a word that felt important to him. And then in March of 1977, the mask slipped. A 24-year-old woman was abducted at gunpoint by Askins and taken back to his home. There, she was sexually assaulted and beaten before eventually being freed. Police arrested Askins quickly, and that's when things got interesting. Because in the D.C. Police Department, it was standard practice at the time to question any rape suspect about the Freeway Phantom murders. The cases were still open, still unsolved, and detectives were still looking for their man. So when Askins was brought in for questioning, homicide detective Lloyd Davis sat down across from him and began asking questions. What Davis discovered made his blood run cold. Askins had been charged with homicide 3 times. He had spent years as a patient at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, the very place near where one of the Phantom's victims had been found. He had a documented, self-proclaimed hatred of women, and he had been living and working in the same neighborhoods where the Freeway Phantom had operated. When police searched Askins' home in the 1700 block of M Street NE, they found a collection of items that raised immediate alarm. There were photographs of girls and young women. There were women's scarves, which was notable given that Brenda Crockett had been strangled with a scarf. There was a knife that had been used in another crime. There was an essay written by a young girl. And in a desk drawer, they found something that stopped the investigation in its tracks. It was an appellate court opinion from Askins' own legal history. And in a footnote, the judge had used the word tantamount, the same word that appeared in the Freeway Phantom's note, the same unusual, distinctive, uncommon word that the killer had dictated to Brenda Woodard as she sat writing her own death sentence in her school notebook. Askins had saved that court document. He had kept it, and he used that same word, tantamount, so frequently that his co-workers had noticed it. Detective Davis was convinced. In his mind, Robert Askins was the Freeway Phantom. The pieces fit. The geography, the timeline, the hatred of women, the connection to St. Elizabeth's, the word, tantamount. It all pointed to one man. Davis obtained a search warrant that specifically named Askins as a suspect in the Freeway Phantom murders. Investigators dug through Askins' backyard with shovels, looking for buried evidence. They searched his vehicle and found 2 gold buttons and a single gold earring underneath the back seat. But that's where the trail ended. The buttons and the earring couldn't be linked to any specific victim. The green fibers found on the Phantom's victims didn't match anything in Askins' home or vehicle. The scarves, the photographs, the knife, the essay, all of it was suspicious, all of it was disturbing, but none of it was conclusive. There was no physical evidence that directly connected Robert Askins to the murder of any of the 6 Freeway Phantom victims. And without that physical evidence, there could be no charges. The circumstantial case was strong. The suspicion was overwhelming. But suspicion isn't proof, and proof was the one thing this investigation never had. Askins was convicted on the kidnapping and rape charges that had originally put him on the police radar. He received a life sentence. He would spend the rest of his days in a federal penitentiary. Detective Davis retired in 1981, but he never let go of the Phantom case. He kept copies of all his notes and reports in boxes stacked in his basement, and he would dig through them from time to time, turning over the same evidence, looking for something he might have missed. He wrote letters to Askins in prison, asking him to confess. Askins wrote back, politely and firmly denying any involvement. He said he did not have the depravity of mind required to commit any of the crimes. Think about that response. A man who had poisoned women with cyanide, stabbed a woman to death, strangled a woman to death, attacked orderlies in a mental hospital, and kidnapped and raped a young woman at gunpoint was claiming to lack the depravity to be the Freeway Phantom. The audacity is almost breathtaking. Robert Askins died on April 30, 2010 at the Federal Correctional Institution in Cumberland, Maryland. He was 91 years old. He took whatever he knew about the Freeway Phantom, if he knew anything at all, to his grave. Now was Robert Askins the Freeway Phantom? Many investigators believe so, and some still do. The circumstantial evidence was compelling. He lived and worked in the right area. He had a history of violence against women that stretched back decades. He was connected to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, which served as what criminologists would later call an anchor point for the killer. He used the word tantamount. He had photographs and scarves and items in his home that raised red flags. But there were problems with the theory too. Askin's known victims were adult women, ranging in age from their 20s to their 40s. The Freeway Phantom's victims were girls, children, and teenagers. That's a significant difference in victim selection. Serial killers typically have a type, and Askin's type, based on his criminal history, was adult women. Transitioning from adult victims to child victims would represent a dramatic shift in behavior. Additionally, the FBI behavioral profile that was completed in 1990 described the Freeway Phantom as likely being between 27 and 2 years old at the time of the murders. In 1971, Askins was 52. That's a significant age gap. While the profile wasn't definitive, and behavioral profiles are far from perfect, the discrepancy was noted, and there was the matter of the green fibers. If Askins was the Phantom, where did the fibers come from? Investigators searched his home and his vehicle and found nothing that matched. Either the source of the fibers had been disposed of years earlier, or Askins wasn't the one leaving them behind. The truth is, we may never know if Robert Askins was the Freeway Phantom. The evidence points to him more strongly than it points to anyone else, but it doesn't point to him conclusively. He was the best suspect the investigation ever produced, and he still wasn't good enough. That tells you everything you need to know about how frustrating this case has been for everyone involved. But the investigation didn't end with Askins. It didn't end with the Green Vega rapists. It didn't end at all. It just kept going, lurching forward in fits and starts, picking up momentum for a while before stalling again, like a car with a failing engine trying to make it up a hill. In the years and decades that followed, the Freeway Phantom case was opened and closed and opened again more times than anyone can count. New detectives would inherit the files, read through the evidence, get excited about a lead, and then hit the same wall that everyone before them had hit. The case became one of the most enduring cold cases in the history of Washington, D.C. It was the kind of case that haunted people, the kind of case that followed detectives into retirement and beyond. And it was about to get worse. Because as the years passed, something happened that would make solving the case not just difficult, but potentially impossible. The evidence started to disappear. Files were lost. Documents were misplaced. Physical evidence, the actual tangible forensic material that had been collected from 6 crime scenes, began to vanish from storage. The breathing samples, the handwriting exemplars, the semen sample that had been collected from one of the victims. Piece by piece, the physical evidence in the Freeway Phantom case was lost, destroyed, or simply could not be accounted for. By the early 2000s, when a new generation of detectives tried to apply modern forensic techniques to the case, they discovered that much of what they needed was simply gone. In 2002, technicians attempted to extract a DNA profile from a semen sample that had been taken during the autopsy of Nenomashi Yates. The sample was old, degraded, and the extraction failed. No usable DNA was recovered. That sample may have contained the genetic fingerprint of the Freeway Phantom, the one piece of evidence that could have identified him with certainty. And it was useless. In 2009, D.C. police admitted something that shook what little faith the family still had in the system. They had lost the original case files, the primary investigative records, the notes, the reports, the timelines, the witness statements, the documents that formed the backbone of the entire investigation were gone. Not destroyed in a fire, not damaged in a flood, just lost. Misplaced in the shuffle of office moves and personnel changes and bureaucratic indifference. The original detectives had kept their own notes, and some of those survived. The FBI had its own records, and Maryland police had maintained their files. But the core D.C. Metropolitan Police case files, the beating heart of the investigation, were gone, for the families of the 6 victims. This was perhaps the cruelest blow of all. Bad enough that their daughters had been murdered. Bad enough that the killer had never been found. Bad enough that the investigation had been plagued by incompetence and political interference from the very beginning. But to lose the evidence, to simply misplace it, as if these were parking tickets and not the records of 6 murdered children, that was a betrayal that went beyond words. And yet, even after all of that, Even after the lost evidence and the failed DNA extraction and the decades of frustration, the case refused to die completely. Because there were people who wouldn't let it. People who kept pushing, kept investigating, kept asking questions. And one of those people was about to pick up the Freeway Phantom files and try one more time to shine a light into the darkness. In 2004, a D.C. Metropolitan Police detective named James Trainum picked up the Freeway Phantom files. Or rather, what was left of them. Trainum was a cold case detective. The kind of investigator who thrived on the cases that other people had given up on. He was methodical, patient, and driven by the kind of quiet obsession that keeps a man awake at 3 a.m, turning over the same questions in his mind, looking for an angle that no one else had tried. He was, in his own words, a fan of intellectual challenges. And the Freeway Phantom was the ultimate intellectual challenge. When Trainum first sat down with the case, the first thing he noticed was the most devastating thing of all. The files weren't there. The primary case files from the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department, the central nervous system of the entire investigation, the documents that should have contained every note, every witness statement, every lead, every dead end, every scrap of information that 3 decades of investigators had compiled, were gone. Not sealed in an evidence room, not filed away in a basement archive, gone. Lost in the shuffle of personnel changes and office moves and the slow, grinding indifference of a bureaucracy that had allowed the most notorious serial killing case in the city's history to simply fall through the cracks. For any other detective, this might have been the end. How do you investigate a case when the investigation itself has been lost? How do you follow leads when the leads have been thrown away? How do you solve a puzzle when half the pieces are missing? But Trainum wasn't any other detective. He started digging. And what he found was that while the D.C. police had lost their files, the FBI had not. The Bureau had maintained its own records from the investigation, and when Trainum tracked down those files, he noticed something telling. On the outside of the box, someone had written a note. It said, "Keep for historical significance." Someone at the FBI, decades earlier, had recognized the importance of these records and made sure they were preserved. It was a small mercy in a case that had precious few of them. Trainum began working from the FBI files. He also reached out to the Maryland police departments that had been involved in the investigation, since most of the victims' bodies had been found in Prince George's County. Their records were incomplete too, but they existed. Piece by piece, fragment by fragment, Trainum began rebuilding the case from the ground up. He read faded newspaper clippings. He pored over old police reports. He drove to the crime scenes and walked the embankments where the bodies had been found, staring at the brush and the weeds and the roaring traffic of Interstate 295, trying to see what the killer had seen, trying to understand why he had chosen these spots. And he went to the families, on a cold February night. Trainum drove out to meet with the relatives of Carol Spinks. He sat in their small living room and looked across at Carolyn Morris, Carol's identical twin. More than 35 years had passed since Carol's murder. But for Carolyn, the grief was as raw as if it had happened yesterday. She told Trainum that the killer lurked in her thoughts and dreams. She said she could feel his presence when she walked down the street. The Freeway Phantom had wrecked her life. After Carol's death, Carolyn had spiraled into drug addiction and alcoholism. She couldn't hold down a job. She couldn't maintain relationships. The twin sister who had been her other half, her mirror image, her best friend, had been ripped away from her at 13 years old, and the wound had never healed. It couldn't heal. How do you heal from something when the cause of the wound is still unknown, when the person who did it is still out there, or was out there, walking free, living their life, while your sister lies in the ground and you're left to carry the weight of it alone? Trainum listened. He made no promises. He was too honest for that, too experienced. He knew what he was dealing with. A case more than 3 decades old, physical evidence destroyed, original files lost, witnesses dead or disappeared, suspects dead. The trail was so cold it was frozen solid. But he told the families he would try. He told them the case mattered. He told them their daughters and sisters hadn't been forgotten. And then he went back to work. One of the first things Trainum did was bring in an expert who could apply a technique that hadn't existed when the original investigation was being conducted. The expert's name was Dr. Kim Rossmo, a former Canadian police officer who had become a professor at Texas State University. Rossmo had pioneered a field called geographic profiling, which uses mathematics and computer analysis to map the spatial patterns of a serial offender's crimes. The idea is straightforward but powerful. By plotting where victims lived, where they were abducted, where their bodies were found, and factoring in things like traffic patterns, road networks, and population density, the computer can identify what's called an anchor point, a location of particular significance to the killer. It might be his home, it might be his workplace. It might be a place where he spent a significant amount of time, a place that held meaning for him, a place he felt safe. Trainum and Rossmo spent weeks working together. They visited the crime scenes. They plotted every known data point on the map. Where Carol Spinks lived, where she was last seen, where her body was found, where Darlinia Johnson was abducted, where Brenda Crockett's body was discovered, where Nenamasha Yates disappeared, where Brenda Woodard got off the bus, where Brian Williams was last seen boarding a bus near Martin Luther King Jr. Avenue. Every location, every intersection, every stretch of freeway, all of it fed into the model. When the results came back, they pointed to one place, one specific, identifiable location that the computer had determined was the killer's most likely anchor point: St. Elizabeth's Hospital, the same psychiatric facility where Carol Spink's body had been found, on the grassy embankment just outside its grounds, the same hospital where Robert Askins had spent 13 years as a patient after being declared criminally insane, the same institution that sat at the geographic center of the entire crime spree, surrounded by the neighborhoods where the victims lived, the streets where they were taken, and the freeways where they were discarded. The geographic profile was clear. Whoever the Freeway Phantom was, he had a deep, significant connection to St. Elizabeth's Hospital. He might have worked there. He might have been a patient there. He might have had a family member who was treated there. But whatever the nature of the connection, Elizabeth's was at the heart of his world. It was his anchor, his center of gravity, the place around which all of his crimes orbited like planets around a dark star. Now, Elizabeth's Hospital wasn't your typical psychiatric facility. It had been built during the Civil War and had served as the primary mental health institution for the Washington, D.C. area for more than a century. By the 1970s, it housed everyone from patients with severe mental illness to veterans returning Vietnam with undiagnosed PTSD. Thousands of people had passed through its doors over the decades. Thousands of patients, thousands of staff members, thousands of visitors. The pool of potential suspects, if you used St. Elizabeth's as your starting point, was enormous, but it narrowed the focus considerably. Before the geographic profile, investigators were essentially looking for a needle in a city-sized haystack. After the profile, they were looking for a needle in a much smaller, more defined space. The question was no longer just, who had the means and motive to commit these crimes? It was, who had the means, the motive, and a significant connection to St. Elizabeth's Hospital. And that question, once again, pointed squarely at Robert Askins. He was the only known suspect who had spent years at St. Elizabeth's. He was the only one who had been institutionalized there for murder. He was the only one who had a documented history of violence against women stretching back decades. The geographic profile didn't prove Askins was the Freeway Phantom, but it made the circumstantial case against him stronger than ever. Trainum, however, was careful not to develop tunnel vision. He knew the danger of locking onto a single suspect and interpreting all the evidence through that lens. That's how innocent people get convicted and people go free. He kept his mind open. He pursued other leads. He explored other possibilities. And he did something else that was new. He went public in 2006, working with the Washington Post. Trainum helped bring the Freeway Phantom case back into the spotlight. The newspaper published a major investigative piece that detailed the history of the case, the failures of the investigation, and the current state of affairs. It was the most comprehensive public accounting of the Phantom murders in years, and it generated a wave of interest. People who had lived in the neighborhoods during the early 70s reached out. Former investigators shared their memories. Tips came in through the police hotline. A reward of $150,000 was offered for information leading to the arrest of the Freeway Phantom. Flyers were distributed throughout the neighborhoods of Southeast and Northeast D.C., including the Congress Heights area that the geographic profile had identified as the killer's home base. Trainum also drew on the FBI Bureau profile that had been completed in 1990. That profile, which was based on the investigative materials and conversations with the original investigators, painted a chilling portrait of the kind of man they were looking for. According to the FBI analysts, the Freeway Phantom was likely a misogynistic psychopath. He was probably between 27 and 32 years old at the time of the murders. He probably lived or worked in Southeast D.C. He was likely someone who had difficulty maintaining relationships with women, someone whose rage and resentment toward the opposite sex had been building for years before it finally erupted into murder. The profile also suggested something that was both revealing and disturbing. Some of the Phantom's victims may have known him. They may have trusted him enough to get into his car willingly. Think about what that means. This wasn't a man who jumped out of the bushes. He wasn't a stranger who grabbed girls off the street by force. At least not always. He was someone who could approach a young girl and make her feel safe enough to accept a ride. He was someone who looked normal, who seemed harmless, who had the kind of face and demeanor that didn't set off alarm bells. The profile described him as an organized killer, someone who planned his crimes, controlled his environment, and cleaned up after himself. He was intelligent, he was careful, and he was, by all outward appearances, an ordinary member of the community. The FBI profile also noted that the killer felt no remorse or guilt. He viewed his victims as objects, as things to be used and discarded. His only concern was that he might be seen with a victim, that he might be recognized, that his double life might be exposed. The analysts wrote that the killer's primary motivation was sexual control and dominance over women. He wasn't driven by anger in the traditional sense. He wasn't lashing out in a blind rage. He was calm, calculated, methodical. The violence was a means to an end, a way to achieve the sense of power and control that he craved, but could not achieve through normal human interaction. The profile suggested two possible explanations for the 10-month gap between the 5th and 6th murders. One was that Brenda Woodard's resistance, her fighting back, her stabbing wounds suggesting a physical struggle, had unsettled the killer. She had disrupted his sense of control. She had made the experience less satisfying, more dangerous, more risky. And so he had retreated temporarily into his fantasies, reliving the earlier killings in his mind rather than seeking new victims. The other possibility was that something external had intervened. Maybe he was incarcerated for an unrelated crime. Maybe he moved away temporarily. Maybe he was hospitalized. Something had interrupted his pattern, and it took 10 months for him to come back. When he did come back for the murder of Diane Williams, he returned to familiar territory. He went back to the Congress Heights neighborhood, the same area where Carol Spinks and Darlenia Johnson had been taken. He was returning to his hunting ground, his comfort zone, the place where he felt safest, where he knew the streets, where he could operate without fear of being recognized. Detective Trainum absorbed all of this. He cross-referenced the profile with the geographic data. He compared the behavioral analysis with the known facts of each crime, and he arrived at a conclusion that, while not definitive, was deeply troubling. The Freeway Phantom was almost certainly someone who had lived in or near the Congress Heights neighborhood. He was almost certainly someone who had a connection to St. Elizabeth's Hospital. He was almost certainly an African-American male who was young enough to be mobile and old enough to have a car and the confidence to approach young girls without raising suspicion. He was someone who blended in, someone who was part of the community but not entirely of it, someone who existed in the spaces between, watched and waiting, until the moment was right. Trainum worked the case until his retirement from the D.C. Metropolitan Police in 2010. Even after leaving the force, he continued to follow the case, to think about it, to turn it over in his mind. He once said that the reason killers like the Freeway Phantom get away with it is because they're not that different from ordinary people. They can pass unnoticed, they go to work. They pay their bills. They say hello to their neighbors. And then when no one is watching, they become something else entirely. In 2009, a year before Trainum's retirement, a glimmer of hope appeared. Maryland authorities informed him that they had located a key piece of evidence that had been thought lost. On the clothing of Diane Williams, the sixth and final victim, there was a potential DNA sample. If the sample could be extracted and profiled, it might be possible to identify the Freeway Phantom through genetic genealogy or a database match. For the first time in decades, there was a real, tangible scientific path to solving the case. But things in the Freeway Phantom investigation never go smoothly. The DNA testing was not fast-tracked. Bureaucratic hurdles slowed the process. Jurisdictional complications arose, as they always seem to in this case. The sample sat, time passed, and the families waited as they had always waited, with a patience born of decades of disappointment, and a hope that refused to die no matter how many times it was kicked. Now, while all of this was happening on the investigative side, the families of the 6 victims were living their own stories. And those stories are, in many ways, just as devastating as the murders themselves. Because the Freeway Phantom didn't just kill 6 girls. He destroyed entire families. He shattered lives that extended far beyond the victims themselves, rippling outward through siblings, parents, uncles, cousins, and friends, leaving behind a wake of grief that has never subsided. Valerie Moore was the older sister who sent Carol Spinks to the 7-Eleven that night. She gave Carol $5 and asked her to pick up some TV dinners and soda. She never forgave herself. For years, the rest of her life, Valerie carried the guilt of that decision. She was the one who sent Carol out the door. She was the one who put her little sister on the path that led to her death. It didn't matter that she couldn't have known. It didn't matter that sending your sister to the store was the most normal, mundane, harmless thing in the world. None of that mattered, because Carol was gone, and Valerie was the one who had sent her away. Valerie would walk the route that Carol had taken. She would retrace her sister's steps, from the house to the 7-Eleven and back, over and over, as if by walking that path enough times she could somehow change the outcome. As if she could go back and catch up to Carol before the killer did. As if she could reach through time and pull her little sister out of harm's way. But she couldn't. The path always ended the same way. With Carol gone and Valerie standing alone on a street that led nowhere. Carolyn Morris, Carol's twin, never recovered from the loss. She described the years after Carol's death as a descent into darkness. She turned to drugs. She turned to alcohol. She couldn't function. She couldn't hold a job. She couldn't maintain relationships. The foundation of her identity, her twinship with Carol, had been ripped out from under her, and she spent decades trying to find her footing in a world that no longer made sense. When Detective Trainum visited her in 2006, 35 years after the murder, Carolyn's grief was still as raw as the day she learned her sister was dead. She told him she could feel the killer's presence. She said he was still out there in her thoughts, in her dreams, in the shadows at the edge of her vision. He had taken her sister, and he had never paid for it. That knowledge was a wound that wouldn't close. Brenda Crockett's little sister, Bertha, the 7-year-old who had answered the phone that night and heard Brenda's voice for the last time, grew up in the shadow of that phone call. Those words, "I'll see you," whispered by her sister in the moments before her death, echoed through Bertha's childhood and into her adult life. She was scared. Not just sad, not just grieving, but scared. She was afraid for herself and for every other little girl in the neighborhood. She had heard the fear in her sister's voice. She had heard the heavy footsteps in the background. She knew, in a way that most children never have to know, how close danger could be, how quickly and completely it could swallow someone you loved. Mary Woodard, Brenda Woodard's mother, described the aftermath of her daughter's death as a period of total shutdown. She couldn't talk to anyone. She couldn't look at photographs. The pain was so enormous, so all-consuming, that it blocked out everything else. It was only through connecting with the families of the other victims that she found some measure of solace. They understood. They were the only ones who truly understood. Because no matter how many people told you they knew what you were going through, they didn't. Not unless they had lived it. Not unless they had buried a child and then watched the system fail to find the person who killed her. Leon Williams and his wife Margaret, the parents of Diane Williams, carried their grief into old age. Leon spoke publicly about his belief that racism had tainted the investigation, that the police would have tried harder if the victims had been white. Margaret, who still lived in the same house where Diane had grown up, where Diane had cooked dinner for the family on the night she was taken, said that even though it happened in 1972, it felt more like it happened yesterday. The passage of time hadn't dulled the pain. It had just stretched it out, turning an acute wound into a chronic one, a sharp pain into a dull, endless ache that colored everything and never went away. Wilma Harper, Diane Williams' aunt, channeled her grief into action. She founded an organization called the Freeway Phantom Organization, dedicated to supporting the friends and family members of murder victims. Harper understood that the families of the FAM's victims weren't just mourning individual losses. They were carrying the weight of an entire community's trauma. The organization became a lifeline, a place where people who had been through the worst could find others who understood. It was a small light in an enormous darkness, but it mattered. It mattered more than Harper probably ever knew. The families also supported each other in ways that went beyond any organization. They became a kind of extended family, bound together by the worst thing that had ever happened to them. They shared their pain. They shared their memories. They shared their anger and their frustration and their enduring, unquenchable hope that someday, somehow, the truth would come out. They attended vigils together. They spoke to reporters together. They pushed the police together. And they waited together year after year, decade after decade, for the phone call that never came, the one that would say, "We got him. We found the man who took your daughter." That call never came. And as the years turned into decades, the families began to front a terrible possibility. Maybe it never would. Maybe the Freeway Phantom would remain exactly that, a phantom, a shadow, a name without a face. Maybe the killer had died of old age in his bed, surrounded by people who never knew what he had done. Maybe he had carried his secret to the grave, and the truth had been buried with him. Maybe the 6 girls he killed would never get their justice. Maybe the only thing left would be the memory, carried by the families who refused to forget. But they didn't stop fighting. Even as the decades passed, even as hope dimmed and the trail grew colder and the system continued to fail them, the families kept pushing. They kept talking to reporters. They kept pressuring the police. They kept showing up at vigils and press conferences and meetings, holding photographs of their daughters and sisters, reminding the world that these girls had existed, that they had mattered, that they deserved to be remembered. And in 2019, something happened that gave the case new life. Blaine Pardoe and his daughter Victoria Hester published a book called Tantamount: The Pursuit of the Freeway Phantom Serial Killer. The book was the most comprehensive account of the case ever written, drawing on years of research, freedom of information requests, interviews with investigators and family members, and access to documents that had never been made public before. Pardoe and Esther meticulously reconstructed the crimes, the investigation, and the failures that had allowed the killer to escape justice. Their work brought the Freeway Phantom back into the public conversation in a way that it hadn't been in years. Then in 2023, journalist Celeste Headley launched a podcast called Freeway Phantom, produced by iHeartRadio and Tenderfoot TV. Headley, a veteran public radio correspondent, had spent 2 years digging through boxes of evidence, interviewing investigators and family members, and following leads that had gone cold decades ago. The podcast was a sensation. It brought the story to a new generation of listeners, many of whom had never heard of the Freeway Phantom before. It raised the same questions that had haunted the investigation since the beginning. Why didn't these murders make national headlines? Did law enforcement do enough? How did racial disparities affect the investigation? And is there still a chance, even now, more than 50 years later, to find the killer? The podcast also explored new evidence and revisited old leads with fresh eyes. It examined the possibility that there were additional victims beyond the 6 that were officially attributed to the Freeway Phantom. One name that came up repeatedly was Tara Ann Bryant, an 18-year-old who had been killed in the same area during the same time period. The FBI had included Bryant in their behavioral profile of the Phantom, suggesting they believed she was a victim of the same killer. But the D.C. and Prince George's County Police had not included her in their official count. Whether Bryant was a 7th victim of the Freeway Phantom remains an open question. The book and the podcast accomplished something that decades of police work had not. They kept the case alive in the public consciousness. They ensured that the names of the 6 victims, Carol Spinks, Darlinia Johnson, Brenda Crockett, Nenemosha Yates, Brenda Woodard, and Diane Williams, would not be forgotten. They created a record, a permanent, accessible, detailed account of what happened to these girls and what happened to the investigation that was supposed to find their killer. And they sent a message to the families, to the public, and maybe even to the killer himself if he was still alive, that this case was not closed, that people were still looking, that the Freeway Phantom, wherever he was, had not been forgotten either. Today, as I'm telling you this story, the case remains officially open. The D.C. Metropolitan Police Department's Major Casey Cold Case Unit, in conjunction with the Prince George's County Police Homicide Unit, continues to seek the public's help. The $150,000 reward for information leading to an arrest remains unclaimed. The families continue to wait. The questions continue to hang in the air unanswered, like the echo of a phone ringing in an empty house. Who was the Freeway Phantom? Was it Robert Askins, the self-proclaimed woman hater who poisoned and strangled and raped his way through decades of violence? Was it a member of the Green Vega rapists, hiding behind the gang's collective denial? Was it someone else entirely, someone whose name never appeared on any suspect list? Someone who lived quietly in the Congress Heights neighborhood and went about his business while 6 families grieved and an entire community lived in fear? The truth is, we don't know. And that's the hardest part of this story. Not the violence, not the horror, not even the failures of the investigation. The hardest part is the not knowing. The hardest part is the silence that stretches from 1972 to today, a silence that has lasted more than 50 years and shows no signs of breaking. But I want to leave you with something other than despair. Because even in the darkest stories there are moments of light. And in the story of the Freeway Phantom, the light comes from the people who refuse to give up. From Detective Romaine Jenkins, who carried the case for years and never stopped believing it could be solved. From Detective Jim Trainum, who picked up the files when everyone else had put them down and spent years trying to rebuild an investigation from the ashes. From Wilma Harper, who turned her grief into a mission and founded an organization that helped other families survive the same kind of pain. From Celeste Headley, who spent 2 years of her life telling this story so that the victims would be remembered. From Blaine Pardo and Victoria Hester, who wrote the book that became the definitive record of the case. And from the families themselves, who have spent more than half a century demanding justice for their daughters and sisters, who have never stopped fighting, never stopped hoping, never stopped believing that someday, somehow the truth would come out. Now I want to take you deeper into something throughout this story, but haven't fully explored. Because to truly understand the Freeway Phantom case, you can't just look at the crimes and the suspects in the investigation. You have to look at the context. You have to look at the world that allowed this to happen. You have to look at the systems, the assumptions, the biases, and the blind spots that turned a solvable case into an eternal mystery. And that means we have to talk about something uncomfortable. We have to talk about why these 6 girls were forgotten. Because they were forgotten, not by their families. Never by their families. But by the system, by the media, by the country, by the machinery of justice that is supposed to treat every victim equally and so rarely does. 6 young black girls were kidnapped, raped, and murdered in the capital of the United States of America. And the story barely made it beyond the local news cycle. Think about that, the nation's capital. The city where laws are made. The city where presidents live. 6 children were killed over a span of 16 months. their bodies dumped along the freeways like garbage, and the national response was a collective shrug. Compare that to other serial killer cases from around the same era. The Zodiac Killer terrorized the San Francisco Bay Area in the late 1960s and early 1970s. His victims were predominantly white, and the case became one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in American history. Books were written. Movies were made. The Zodiac's letters to the press became iconic artifacts of true crime culture. Entire generations of amateur detectives have spent their lives trying to crack the Zodiac's codes. The case is embedded in the American consciousness in a way that few criminal cases ever achieve. The son of Sam, David Berkowitz, terrorized Nudie in 1976 and 1977. His victims were predominantly white. The case dominated national headlines for months. It was front-page news across the country. When Berkowitz was caught, it was treated as a cultural event. The entire nation breathed a sigh of relief. Ted Bundy, the Green River Killer, the BTK Strangler. These names are household words. They've been the subjects of countless books, documentaries, films, and television series. Their victims are remembered, their stories told and retold, their cases analyzed and dissected by experts and enthusiasts alike. And the Freeway Phantom, 6 victims, 16 months of terror. A killer who taunted the police with a handwritten note, who forced a 10-year-old girl to call her family from captivity, who called a grieving family to say, "I killed your daughter." A case with every element that should have made it a national obsession. And yet, until very recently, most Americans had never heard of it. Most true crime enthusiasts had never encountered the name. Most people, if you asked them about serial killers in Washington, D.C., would mention the D.C. sniper attacks of 2002 and draw a blank on everything else. The reason is as simple as it is painful. The victims were black, they were female, and they were poor. They existed at the intersection of every category that American society has historically deemed expendable. They were not the kind of victims who inspired Time news specials. They were not the kind of victims whose photographs were plastered across magazine covers. They were not the kind of victims who moved the needle of public outrage in a country that has always valued some lives more than others. This isn't speculation. This isn't opinion. This is a documented, studied, well-established pattern in American criminal justice. Researchers have a name for it. They call it missing white woman syndrome. The term describes the media's disproportionate focus on cases involving white, middle-class or upper-class female victims, while cases involving victims of color, particularly black women and girls, receive a fraction of the coverage. Study after study has shown that when a white girl goes missing, the media mobilizes. When a black girl goes missing, the silence is deafening. The Freeway Phantom case is a textbook example of this disparity. In 1971 and 1972, while 6 black girls were being murdered in D.C., the national media was focused on the Vietnam War, on Watergate, on the political upheavals of the era. Those were important stories, no question. But the murder of 6 children should have been important too. It should have broken through. It should have demanded attention. It didn't. And the families knew it. They felt it. They lived with the knowledge that their daughters' lives were considered less newsworthy, less valuable, less worthy the nation's attention than the lives of white victims in other cities. Evander Spinks, Carol's sister, didn't mince words. She said plainly that if the victims had been white girls, the police would have solved the cases. Lean Williams, Diane's father, said the same thing. He questioned why the police assumed the killer was black. He questioned why they weren't investigating white suspects with equal vigor. He questioned whether the investigation had been conducted with the same urgency and resources that would have been brought to bear if the victims had looked different, had come from different neighborhoods, had different last names. These weren't paranoid accusations. These were observations grounded in a reality that the families lived every single day. They watched as the investigation stumbled. They watched as leads were missed and evidence was lost. They watched as the task force was assembled too late and then dissolved too soon. They watched as the FBI was pulled away from the case to focus on Watergate. Think about that for a moment. The FBI diverted resources from the investigation of 6 murdered children to focus on a political scandal. Watergate was important, yes. It shook the foundations of American democracy. But so did the message that was being sent to the black community of D.C., the message that their children's lives were not a priority, the message that the murder of 6 young girls could wait. And it wasn't just the FBI. The entire response from the very beginning was marked by a pattern of deprioritization that is impossible to separate from race. The police didn't connect the first 2 murders. They didn't publicly acknowledge a serial pattern until the 4th victim. They were slow to respond about bodies found along the freeway. They allowed a politician to blow up their best lead by going public with information about an informant. They lost the case files, they lost the physical evidence. Every single one of these failures, taken individually, might be explained away as incompetence or bad luck. But taken together, they paint a picture of a system that simply did not treat these cases with the seriousness they deserved. And the community felt it. The neighborhoods of Southeast DC felt it. These were people who already had a complicated relationship with law enforcement. In the early 1970s, trust between the black community and the police was low, eroded by years of racial profiling, excessive force, and institutional neglect. The Freeway Phantom case only made it worse. Here was the ultimate test of the system's commitment to protecting black lives, and the system was failing. Spectacularly, publicly, undeniably. Community organizer Doe Wheeler tried to fill the gap. She organized search parties. She held press conferences. She demanded more police patrols, better street lighting, fewer abandoned buildings. She did the work that the system should have been doing. And for her efforts, she received threatening phone calls and letters from someone claiming to be the killer. The voice told her to stop, or her own daughters would end up on the side of the road. Wheeler was being threatened for trying to protect her community because the people who were supposed to protect it weren't doing their job. Now, I want to be fair. There were individual officers who cared deeply about this case. Detective Romaine Jenkins cared. Detective Lloyd Davis cared. Detective Jim Trainum cared. These were people who gave significant portions of their careers, and in some cases their retirement years, to trying to solve the Freeway Phantom murders. They lost sleep over it. They carried it with them. They couldn't let it go. And their dedication should be recognized and honored. But individual dedication cannot compensate for systemic failure. One good detective can't fix a broken evidence storage system. One dedicated investigator can't overcome the loss of original case files. One committed officer can't reverse the damage done by years of underfunding, understaffing, and institutional indifference. The problem was never that no one cared. The problem was that the system, as a whole, didn't care enough. Not enough to prevent the failures. Not enough to ensure the evidence was preserved. Not enough to keep the investigation going with the resources and urgency it demanded. Not enough to treat 6 murdered black girls with the same weight and seriousness that would have been automatically granted to victims of a different color. This is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of the Freeway Phantom case. The killer bears the primary responsibility for the murders. He is the one who kidnapped, raped, and strangled 6 girls. He is the monster in this story. But the system bears responsibility too. The system allowed him to continue killing when earlier intervention might have stopped him. The system allowed evidence to be lost and leads to be squandered. The system allowed the case to go cold and stay cold for decades. And the system allowed 6 families to live their entire lives without answers, without closure, without the basic justice that every murder victim's family deserves. Now let me bring you back to the killer himself. Because even after all these years, even with the evidence destroyed and the files lost and the suspects dead, there are still things we can piece together about the Freeway Phantom. The behavioral profile, the geographic profile, the patterns of the crimes themselves, all of these tell us something about who this person was and how he operated. And understanding the killer, even in the abstract, matters. It matters because it keeps the investigation alive. It matters because every detail, no matter how small, might be the thing that triggers a memory in someone who was alive in D.C. in the early 70s. Someone who knew a man who lived near St. Elizabeth's. Someone who noticed a neighbor acting strangely during the summer of 1971. Someone who heard something, saw something, suspected something, but never came forward because they didn't think it mattered. It matters. So let's talk about what we know. The Freeway Phantom was almost certainly a black male. This conclusion is based on several factors. Hair evidence found on 3 of the victims was consistent with an African American. One witness saw Darlenia Johnson in a car with an older black male. The FBI behavioral profile noted that serial killers overwhelmingly tend to target victims within their own racial demographic. And the nature of the abductions, girls being taken from predominantly black neighborhoods without any witnesses reporting seeing a white stranger in the area, suggests the killer blended in. He was part of the community, or at least appeared to be. He was likely in his late 20s to early 30s at the time of the murders, based on the FBI profile. He was probably employed, possibly in a job that gave him flexibility of movement and access to a vehicle. He may have worked in a field that brought him into contact with young people, perhaps at a recreation center, a school, or a community organization. The fact that several of his victims were abducted while walking to or from stores suggests he may have been watching them, stalking them, learning their routines before making his move. He owned a car. That much is almost certain. The distances between the body dump sites were too great to be covered on foot. He needed a vehicle to transport his victims and to access the freeways where he left their bodies. One witness reported seeing a victim in an older black car. Another reported a blue Volkswagen. Whether these were the same vehicle described differently or different vehicles entirely is unknown. But the killer had reliable transportation, and he was comfortable driving the highways and freeways of the D.C. metro area at night. He had a connection to St. Elizabeth's Hospital. The geographic profile established this with mathematical certainty. Whether he was a patient, an employee, a visitor, or simply someone who spent a significant amount of time in the area, St. Elizabeth's was at the center of his world. 2 of his victims were found on or near the hospital grounds. The hospital sat at the geographic midpoint between the abduction sites and the dump sites. It was his anchor, his base, his point of reference. He was organized and disciplined. He left almost no physical evidence behind. In an era before DNA technology and surveillance cameras, this might seem less remarkable, but consider the scale of his crimes: 6 abductions, 6 murders, multiple body dump sites across 2 jurisdictions, and in all of that, the only physical evidence he left behind were some fibers, some hairs, and a handwritten note that he didn't even write himself. He was meticulous about covering his tracks. He cleaned the crime scenes. He transported the bodies without being seen. He disposed of them in locations that he had likely scouted in advance. This was not a man who acted on impulse. He planned. He prepared. He executed. He also had a psychological need for control. The phone calls that Brenda Crockett was forced to make, the note that Brenda Woodard was forced to write, the calls to the victims' families, these were all expressions of control. He didn't just want to kill. He wanted to manipulate. He wanted to play puppet master, pulling the strings of his victims and their families and the police, directing the narrative, controlling the information, deciding who knew what and when. The note in Brenda Woodard's pocket was the purest expression of this need. He sat next to a girl he was about to murder and dictated a message to her, a message that celebrated his own cruelty and dared the police to catch him. That's not the behavior of someone who is out of control. That's the behavior of someone who is very much in control and wants everyone to know it. He kept trophies. Investigators noted that the victim's shoes were taken in almost every case. Shoes. Think about why a killer would take his victim's shoes. It's not practical. It doesn't help him avoid detection. It doesn't serve any logical purpose. But for a certain kind of killer, they're souvenirs. They're mementos. They allow the killer to relive the experience long after the crime is over. Every time he looked at those shoes, every time he touched them, he was transported back to the moment of the kill, the power, the control, the feeling of having another person's life in his hands. Authors Blaine Pardo and Victoria Hester noted in their research that the killer appeared to have kept other items as well. Textbooks from one victim, hair curlers from another, shoelaces, small, personal items that meant nothing to anyone else but meant everything to him. They were his collection, his private museum of horror. And somewhere, in someone's house, in someone's attic, in someone's storage unit, those items may still exist. Pardo expressed the hope that someday, a family member of the killer might stumble across these things and wonder why he kept them. Why did he have a child's textbook? Why did he have girls' shoes? Why did he have hair curlers that didn't belong to anyone in the house? That moment of recognition, that moment of realization, could be the thing that finally breaks this case open. But we're not there yet. We're still in the space between. The space where hope lives alongside despair. Where the possibility of justice coexists with the probability that it will never come. And so the question hangs in the air, as it has hung for more than 50 years. Who was the Freeway Phantom? Was he Robert Askins, the woman-hating killer who lived near the crimes and used the word tantamount like a verbal fingerprint? Was he a member of the Green Vega Rapists, hiding behind the gang's wall of denial? Was he someone else entirely? Someone whose name has never appeared in any report, someone who lived and died in anonymity, carrying his secret like a stone in his pocket? Or is he still alive? The FBI profile suggested the killer was in the 30s to early 30s in 1971. If that's accurate, he would be in his 80s today. Old, yes, but possibly alive. Possibly sitting somewhere right now, watching television or reading a newspaper or eating dinner. Living out his twilight years in the quiet comfort of a life that no one suspects was built on the bones of 6 murdered children. That's the thought that keeps the families awake at night. That's the thought that drives investigators to keep the file open. That's the thought that makes this case different from so many others. Because the Freeway Phantom might still be out there, not hunting anymore, not killing anymore, breathing, existing, carrying a secret that 6 families have spent more than 50 years trying to uncover. And if he is out there, if he is still alive, then there's still a chance. A small chance, a long shot as Detective Trainum would say. But a chance nonetheless, because secrets have a way of coming out. Guilt has a way of eroding silence. And time, which has been the enemy of this investigation for 5 decades, can sometimes become its ally. People talk on their deathbeds. People confess to priests and bartenders and old friends. People leave behind diaries and letters and boxes of personal effects that tell stories they never intended to share. Someone, somewhere, knows something. That's what every investigator who has ever worked this case believes. Someone knows who the Freeway Phantom was. Maybe they've known all along. Maybe they've been carrying it for years. Afraid to come forward, afraid of the consequences, afraid of what it would mean to admit that someone they loved, someone they trusted, someone they thought they knew, was capable of the most horrific acts imaginable. If you're that person, if you're listening to this right now and you know something, anything about the Freeway Phantom murders, the D.C. Metropolitan Police still have a tip line open. The case is still active. The $150,000 reward is still available. And the families are still waiting. They've been waiting for more than 50 years. They've waited longer than most of these girls were alive. They've waited through grief and anger and disappointment and betrayal by the system that was supposed to help them. And they're still waiting because they have no other choice. Because giving up would mean accepting that their daughters and sisters died for nothing. And that's something they refuse to do. So where does that leave us? It leaves us exactly where we've been for more than 50 years. In the dark, in the silence, in the space between questions and answers, where the truth should be but isn't. 6 girls. Carol Denise Spinks, 13 years old. Darlenia Denise Johnson, 16. Brenda Faye Crockett, 10. Ninomasha Yates, 12. Brenda Denise Woodard, 18. Danise Williams, 17. 6 names that should be spoken more often than they are. 6 lives that were stolen before they had a chance to begin. 6 families who have spent decades carrying a weight that no family should ever have to carry. The Freeway Phantom took everything from these girls. He took their futures. He took their dreams. He took the women they would have become, the lives they would have lived, the children they might have had, the grandchildren who'd have carried their names forward. He took all of it. And then he disappeared. He slipped back into the world like a shadow merging with the night, and the world let him go. But the world shouldn't have let him go. The system shouldn't have let him go, and we shouldn't let him go now, because these girls mattered. They mattered then, even when the system acted like they didn't, and they matter now. Even though more than 50 years have passed and the trail has gone cold, and the evidence has been lost and the suspects have died, they matter because they were human beings. They were someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's twin, someone's baby. They had names and faces and voices and laughs and dreams, and every single one of those things was taken from them by a man who has never answered for what he did. This case is still open. The reward is still there, and somewhere, someone knows something. Maybe it's you. Maybe it's someone you know. Maybe it's a detail that seems small, that seems insignificant, that you've been carrying around for years without realizing what it means. But it might be the piece that completes the puzzle. It might be the thing that finally brings the Freeway phantom out of the shadows and into the light. Carolinia, Brenda, Nenamashia, Brenda, Diane, say their names, remember them, because they deserve to be remembered, not as victims, not as case numbers, not as entries in a cold case file, but as girls, as children, as people who were loved and who are still loved and who will always be loved by the families who have never stopped fighting for them. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the case, leave a comment and subscribe. Good night and stay safe.